Hi, everybody. Beautiful. Let's get started in just 1 minute. We'll let everybody kind of filter in and get adjusted to the audio. Yeah. I think I see a few familiar faces in here, so that's exciting. Yeah. Give it 1 more minute. Hi, everyone. Super grateful to have you joining me here today. My name is Jessie. I am a coach on our Denver campus. In addition to being a coach, I also lead workshops on professional development as a dev. So our talk today is going to be about presenting a really strong GitHub. You can kind of think of your GitHub as being your LinkedIn for engineering managers and technical recruiters and anyone on a potential team where they're going to be looking to get a general sense for your capabilities as a developer, but also how you code and how professional and clean and readable it is. So really excited to have that talk with you all today. There will be a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to save your questions for that and we'll chat about them. But other than that, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Yeah, all right. Give me a second here. No, there we go. All righty. And we'll present. All right, so welcome to what makes a strong GitHub. As I said earlier, reasons for having a strong GitHub, we want to impress technical recruiters and hiring managers through our GitHub presence, but especially anyone on an engineering team that's going to be interviewing us, right? Cool, so let's go ahead and dive in. What we're going to cover today is the GitHub portal itself. You can really think about the GitHub portal as kind of being a profile for your technical presence. So really important to hone in on some critical details there. We're going to be discussing the repos themselves. So any of the repos that you have pinned to your portal and what the code should look like and what we're generally looking for. We're also going to dive into the code itself. And just a little bit of background on myself. Before I was a coach in my past life, I also worked as a technical recruiter. So I worked with engineering teams to get people roles on those teams. So I know what goes on from both sides of the table, right? Cool. All right, so what we're looking for in the GitHub portal, like I said, it's like a technical profile. So we're looking into that contributions graph, contribution activity, profile information, and pinned repos. So we're really going to dive into what each of these little categories is and what we're looking for and what should really stand out to us the second we land on that page, right? Cool. So this is one of my coworkers. I think that he has a really stellar GitHub profile. So I'm going to kind of walk through some of the sections that we just named, right? So down here, you see that contributions graph, which is that graph at the bottom where it says 709 contributions in the last year. Something to keep in mind on this is that both me and my coworker were teachers, right? So we hope that we can code every single day. However, we don't always get that time in. But for you all, this should be pretty consistently bright green, right? So a lot of green, pretty solid. In this overview, he has pinned all of the projects that he feels are open to viewing, right? So every single project that is pinned here in this overview section should be resume ready, right? It should be perfect. You should feel really good about showing it off to technical recruiters, engineering managers, etc., right? Additionally, for each of these pinned repos, he has his bio there, so a little description, which is good. Professional photo, right? Your LinkedIn photo, get it on your GitHub. And then he has the bio here, where he works, his email address, and relevant links. So those relevant links could be your LinkedIn. They could also be, if you have a portfolio website, this would be a really good place to put that as well. But just really making this inviting, kind of giving people a general sense of who you are as a developer. Yeah, cool. All right, so diving into this contributions graph, right? The contributions graph represents when you're coding and how often you're coding during those coding sessions. So there's that scale, right? I'm just gonna look in chat really quick. Yes, cool. The new README, yeah, we can talk about that at the end. All right, so with this contributions graph, It's letting us know how often you're committing, right? So every day if you get a commit in, you'll get a little green square. And then the color gradient represents how many commits you've made, right? So you can get a green square from a single commit, and then I believe it's like 10 to 20, it's a slightly darker green square, 20 to 30 darker, and then 30 plus, you get the, it just stops it, so you get the full saturated dark green. Yeah, awesome. So this is this little meme that I really like. When a subway station is a better programmer than you are. I get a lot of humor as this because, as I said earlier, it's sometimes difficult to find the time to code every day, even though we ought to be, right? And the reason for that is because technical recruiters, engineering managers really look to how often you're committing to denote how passionate you are about code. It's not simply, are they putting the work in, although there's a little bit of that too. It's really, are they really passionate about code? Do they love it so much that it's something that they do every single day, right? So this subway tile is a better programmer than me, and that's okay. I think it would be pretty impossible to get to this level, but it is something to strive for, right? Cool. So the contributions graph, just to recap, what is it? It denotes when you're committing every day and how often you're doing it in that single day, right? Does it matter? It absolutely does, right? It's one of the first things people look at is, are you coding every single day, especially for junior developers, because there's kind of this perception that you are earning your way into this industry, right? And so they want to see that you're super passionate and putting the time into code. Do the different colors matter? Yes and no, right? You don't want to just be all light green and then they dig into your profile and realize that you've just been committing it a README every day, right? It should be a pretty big diversity of color, right? So some light green to dark green, but mostly a mix of like that light to medium green. Yeah. Awesome. So now I want to dive into the contribution activity. So in this contribution activity section, we're actually seeing what is behind those green commits, right? We even see the light green to dark green scale denoted on the side of these. Things that we look for in this contribution activity, I want to see that it's not just forked projects, that you're working your own projects, right? Potentially that you're working in something open source, that you're working in a lot of different technologies and repos. Those are things that we're going to look for in that contribution activity. That being said, like, don't worry about it too much. No one's obsessing over the contribution activity, but we are just scanning through it to kind of get a general sense of what is it that they're working on right now. Yeah. Cool. So what are we looking for? Any contributions to open source, right? Are you passionate about being in the community, participating in the community, learning how best to participate in the community? Open source is a great way to do that, hint, hint. So that's something that we look for, right? The group collab. Are you working on projects with other people? Are you working on projects of greater size code base, right? Are you getting some experience with something that's maybe a little bit beyond just a single application that you're building on your own, right? And then finally, your own repos. So again, it doesn't need to be all open source. It doesn't need to be all group collab, but something we for sure look for is that you're not just forking and doing lessons, but you're actually working in your own projects, right? Cool. So the profile information, nice professional photo. Something to note on the professional photo is that every industry, every city is really different. Like for example, Denver, I tend to feel pretty split, right? On the one hand, we have a lot of fintech, a lot of med tech, and for that, like, I'm gonna wanna use a button down, nice blazer, maybe a suit jacket, right? But on the alternative, we're also granola, right? So I kind of compromise and go for something like this, nice shirt and a blazer. So for your GitHub photo, you can be a little bit more casual. However, I wouldn't necessarily go full blown just t-shirt, right? But a little bit more casual than your LinkedIn is okay. Your bio information, truly you can just copy your bio from your LinkedIn and paste it in. You can up it a little bit to be more tech specific, since we are really marketing to people that are aware of technologies with our GitHub. So feel free to list the tech that you work in, right? Feel free to list the tech that you're excited about pursuing in this bio. Yeah. And then finally, your contact information. So that's really important. If you are contributing to open source, if you are working for volunteer organizations like Code for America, right? Chances are that developers, you're all going to be on your GitHub, You're going to be viewing each other's GitHub and viewing some of these shared repos. And so you want it to make it really easy for a developer that sees you working in these shared repos to reach out to you. And I've actually seen this happen with students where they work on an open source project, they make a pull request, someone is really interested in the pull request they made, they go look up their contact information and they get an interview. That's happened with some of my students before. So really important, have your contact information, have it linked to your portfolio, linked to your LinkedIn, and most importantly, your email. Because a lot of developers tend to prefer email or like a Denver, like a shared Slack channel space over LinkedIn. Cool. So these pinned repos. So like I said, all of the repos on that GitHub overview, so where I showed you that, that screen that had those little boxes with the pinned repos, those should all be resume ready. So great README, great code, you feel good about it. Someone could dive into your code base and not hit a bug, right? Those should all be really good. And don't feel bad if that's only like 1 to 2 right now, right? It's better to have 2 that are stellar and show off versus like 4 to 6 that half of them are broken, right? It should be things that you're really proud of. For this pin repo, again, just most important thing is that it's resume ready and clean, but underneath that, at least one project that you've committed to recently, right? So make sure that you're just actively coding and maybe actively improving. You have that pinned to your overview. A diversity of technology, right? So for a lot of us, like myself included, I do a ton of work in JavaScript and front end, but I think it's important that I also show off like some back end projects. So if you're learning Python, right, or you're learning Vue or Go, make sure that you're showing off some of those repos that you've been experimenting with in other technologies, right? And then projects that you've created and contributed to. So this is really important. It should not be a tutorial. It should not be a lab. It needs to be something original from yourself to show off how you code, right? And some people are a little bit different on this tutorial thing. I know for myself and the teams that I work with, a lot of the feedback that I get is they really want to see how you code. And if you're just following along to a tutorial, it's not really your code, it's somebody else's, right? So for these pinned repos, make sure that it's something original. Yeah, cool. So just getting back to that overview. So we have the nice professional photo, my coworker, just nice button down. I think this is perfect for Denver, probably for some of the other West Coast cities as well. Programmer who was a chemist with a passion for puzzles. So I know this is different than his LinkedIn bio. I think this is pretty programmer friendly, right? His contact information, and then his LinkedIn, right? And as we can see, we have this diversity of technology. We have Ruby, we have JavaScript, we have Python. Every single one of these repos has a bio underneath describing what it is. And then every single one of these repos is something that he has an attached README for that looks really good, that he's proud to show off, right? Cool. So let's move on. So as developers, we can talk about what a pinned repo must have, right? I kind of listed off a few of them, but really getting into the nitty-gritty here, a solid README. So you can do a lot of searching on what a good README includes, right? But typically you want to have at least photos, if not GIFs, that demonstrate what it does. A really thorough story of what the user experience is, and then how to actually get the app up and running, right? So I've seen READMEs that read like essay length, right? And you don't have to do that. But if you just cover those basics of at least photos or GIFs, a link to the demonstration video or the deployed site, right? The user story, and then how to get it up and running. So something else I advise is, unless you have a project that you put a lot of work in on the back end, if you put a lot of work in on a back end, pin that, right? Absolutely pin that to your overview. However, I think for, and maybe I'm not speaking for everyone, but I know for myself, I do a lot of work in the front end, right? So my back ends aren't really where I want the attention to go. So what I'll do is I'll pin my front end projects, but have a link to my back end repo. Okay, so I'll link my backend repo in the README for my front end project. Cool. Description and deployment link, right? So we talked about that a little bit. So you can actually, there is a section in your README to make sure that you're adding in a description there in the repo, right? So the repo itself has a description tab that you can add that into. It also has a tab for your deployment link. Make sure you're putting that in there. Commit messages are properly syntaxed and professional. Okay, so I see this a lot. Where it's 12 o'clock at night and we just want to get this thing done and committed. And so we might say expletive, oh my God, it's working. Okay. All of the technical recruiters and engineering managers that look at your code base, which they will, that is the first thing they're going to see is that commit message wherever you changed a file that is like expletive, it's working. Okay. Something that I get a lot of feedback on is that teams are looking for people with Git and GitHub experience, so Git workflow, right? One of the biggest denotations that you're not quite at a professional level yet is when you're not properly syntaxing your commit messages and it's unprofessional, right? So what we want to look for with this is technically the proper syntax of a commit message is imperative case. Okay, so imperative case meaning command. We want to command our computer to add this new functionality in, right? So that might be added header would be past tense versus imperative tense would be add header. It's a command, right? So that is the correct syntax for commit messages. You want it to address the functionality that you are providing and you want it to be a command. That being said, I think people are a little bit less nitpicky on the imperative case, but technically it's supposed to be imperative for commit messages. We are commanding our application with this new commit. Cool. But then absolutely just keep it professional. Yeah. So following file structure conventions specific to that technology. So this is something that actually does take a little bit of reading and research, right? I think for a lot of us, we want to just get something up and running and we might not take a lot of time to see how the industry is actually organizing that specific technology. I think it's really important to invest some time into looking into how specific technology should be organizing its files, right? So for the front end, big trend is modularization, right? So even in our vanilla JavaScript app, we want to make sure that we're breaking things up into our modules. And if we are having individual styling for each module, those are going to go into a folder that's named after a feature, right? Something like React tends to give us modularization already, but we can still make sure that we are correctly breaking up those file structures. So on a vanilla React app, we're going to have our components folder, we're going to have an assets folder, we're going to have a styles folder, right? For something like React Native, we need our screens folder and our components folder and our styles folder. So just being really conscious of how the industry is structuring a given technology. And you can find that by Googling, right? Cool. And then finally, clean code. And we're going to talk about some of the things that I look for and that other people on teams look for a clean code. Cool. All right, so what makes a good README? We talked about this a little bit, but including demo videos and deployment links for sure, if you have them, very important. Include GIFs. So if you can include a GIF, all the better, but at the very least screenshots of your application. Some extras with this are your planning tools, right? So if you had wireframes that you drew out, include those. Your user stories, include those. And then finally, if you happen to write a blog post about a project, link it, right? And then if you have a pretty basic backend that you don't necessarily want someone digging around in, right? Just link the backend repo into the front end repo. Cool. All right, so I want us to just navigate through GitHub really fast. I think for a lot of us, we're pretty familiar with it, but I'm just kind of going to go through and look at some of these. Cool. So let's hop on to my, this guy. And there we go. And we're just going to look into this overview really quick. There we go. All right, so for mine, professional photo, my contact information, where you can get in touch with me on LinkedIn, where I work currently, and then my bio is much more technology specific compared to my LinkedIn bio, right? The projects I have in now, I could probably be a little bit more technologically diverse, right? Including like some of the Python or Flutter stuff that I've worked on, but for now I'm React, right? So let's go take a look here. So this is a pretty basic README. So as you can see, I have my folders structured. So I have my screenshots and my SRC. In this case, I didn't break it up into components, but rather features, because I had individual style sheets for each feature, right? So those are going into its own folder. And then we can take a look at the README really quick. So README is pretty straightforward and simple, but I have my demo video here, basic file and what it's doing, and then some screenshots through the user flow, right? How it's built, the features. So this is pretty clean and simple. I would say this is probably the minimal amount that you should do, and then just plan on building from there. Yeah. So let's go back to our presentation and jump back in here. All right, cool. So just again, a recap on those commit messages, imperative case. People are a little bit more flexible on that, but might as well do it the right way. Must be specific to the functionality that you're adding, changing, deleting. That's really important, right? The ability to discuss our code and what we're doing is just as important as our ability to code, because we're ultimately going to be working on a team with other people. We need to be able to talk about and clearly to know what we're making, right? What we're doing. And then finally, keeping it professional, right? So none of this, it works at midnight. Make sure that it's a clean commit message. Cool. And then the file structure, right? Research file organization, practice explaining why you organized it that way to a friend or even your career coach. This is a really simple thing that you can do. It's something that I always ask my students about when they want to do a mock tech review with me. Be able to explain why you structured your app a certain way. Cool. And kind of on this note, especially if you're using Rails, you get a lot of extra stuff with Rails. Make sure that you know what the extra stuff is doing and why it's there, because people will ask you about that. Cool. Let's dive into some clean code. Awesome. So principles that we're judging code by. Code should be creative. So what I tend to mean by this is that it's not something that was generated, right, with like a shortcut command. It's something that is really specific to the problem that you are trying to solve, right? Always remove your console logs. Always, 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 always. There is no debate on this. Console logs must be removed. Code should be properly structured, and we're actually going to go further into depth into each of these points. But properly structured, follow the single responsibility principle, tell a story with its naming scheme, right? And it shouldn't be repeating itself. It should be dry. And then conscientious with our data. So let's dive into what each of these guys means. So creative code, unique to what your application is doing, right? So a great example of this is if you write a backend, you could use the scaffolding command. A lot of us know instantly what happens when someone scaffolds. And so there's a lot of extra things that you're not using and that don't actually meet the purpose or intent of your application. So what we want to see is code that wasn't just copied and fillered from like Stack Overflow. Using Stack Overflow is fine, but know why you're using it. Be able to explain why it's there, and most importantly, know that it is not extra and that it's not doing anything, right? If it's not doing anything, it should not be there. How much of this did you write yourself versus generated with a shortcut command, right? So we are going to ask you about your code. We're going to ask you why you wrote something a certain way. If there's something that you're a little iffy on, we're probably going to be able to pick that up, right? So make sure that you're able to explain your code, and if there's something that doesn't belong there, get rid of it, right? Cool. Removing console logs. So console logs and comments, the community is a little bit split on comments, but they are 100% united on console logs. 100% of programmers agree you should not have console logs in your submitted code, right? So we should be using console logs as a tool all while we're coding, but when it comes to actually submitting something for a final review, they need to be out of there. Same goes for catch and try statements. So I know there's a lot of things that we solve in JavaScript with our catch and tries. Find other ways to solve that problem because you will get asked about them. 50% of the community feels the same way about comments. So my take on comments is that if you're having to use a comment, you are not correctly naming your functions and variables, right? So I feel like I should be able to know what's going on from your naming. If you have a comment there to explain what's happening, typically that's indicative of poor naming, and the code is not following that single responsibility principle, right? It's trying to do more than it should be. That being said, There's a lot of people that actually look for comments in your code. So I would say if you're trying to get clarity on that, if you happen to know someone on the team, which hopefully you do if you're networking, right? Ask them about how they feel about comments, right? Additionally, a different way that you can handle this is have a printout of all of the things that you did along the way, supplementary to your code, right? So I have a friend that got a job that he felt underqualified for, but they were really impressed because he brought in a binder explaining everything that he did for their code challenge and why, right? So that's how he handled comments. And it was really successful for him. He got the job, you know? So then what we're looking for, did you remove all the console logs? Did you remove the try catch statements? And the way that I kind of think of this as is, did you show up to the interview with a stained shirt, right? That's kind of what it looks like if you leave console logs and try catches in your statement. It looks like you don't really care. So that's why we want to remove those. Cool. So some properly structured code. I think you all are pretty good on how we should structure our code and what indentation should look like, but obviously proper indentation is something that's pretty critical to us. We want to make sure that things are following the protocol for how they should be indented, things are following correct naming scheme. Great tool for that would be a linter. That's a lot of feedback that I get is, why aren't you using a linter, right? So keep that in mind. Just throw a linter in there. It's going to fix your spacing for you, right? Cool. So this is just an example of some improperly structured code. I feel like we have a pretty good understanding of what is and isn't improperly structured code. But from this, we can see our indentation is all off. We have this all the way to the furthest left. There's a console log in here. Our map statement doesn't make sense here. Second. What just happened? Give me a second. I think I pressed the wrong button there. All right, cool, right? And then this is just not indented at all. So be aware of indentation, be aware of structure. It's something that without even diving into the code, we're able to take a look at and kind of get a nice idea if they know what they're doing, right? Okay. Your code tells a story. So variable namings should be specific to the data that they're storing, right? Function names should be specific to the function that they are performing, but abstract enough to be reusable and handling different kinds of data. So this one kind of goes back and forth. You want to be specific enough to understand it with your function naming and be able to explain it. But keep in mind, especially in a professional development job, what we're needing to do is kind of always changing to meet the client's needs. So we want our function naming to be representative of the functionality and abstract so that we can reuse it for different kinds of data, right? So a great test for this is explain it to one of your developer friends, right? Or just have them read through it and see if they can tell you what it's doing. And then a further great test for this is actually having someone that's maybe a little bit non-technical read through your code, see if they can kind of tell you what's going on, right? Just from your variable naming and function naming. Cool. So the single responsibility principle, hopefully we're all pretty familiar with this at this point, but a function should be responsible for one thing, right? So we don't want it to be invoking a lot of different pieces of functionality. It should just be one. So a way that we can tell or denote this is that a function should be 2 to 5 lines of code, right? And we always want to be careful of that balance between cleverness and readability. However, oftentimes the shorter function is more readable. So we want to make sure that we are hitting that 2 to 5 lines of code as our goal and making sure it's only responsible for a single piece of functionality, right? And this is one of those things that it's pretty easy without even diving into the code to see that this isn't being honored, because we'll see functions that are greater than 5 lines of code, right? Cool. So code that does not follow the single responsibility rule, right? I think this is like close to 10 to 15 lines of code. It's all shoved in here. It's clearly responsible for more than one thing. I have this render bagel function, this create delete button, this fetch. There's a lot going on in this function. This does not honor that principle. I don't really even need to dive into the code to realize that, right? I can just see the naming and the big clump of lines, right? Cool. So questions you can ask yourself, do any of the functions exceed 3 to 5 lines of code, right? Have you had someone else read through your code and really give you some feedback? Can they tell you what is happening based on the naming and the structure, right? So that's a technical person like a cohort mate and a non-technical person potentially like your coach, right? Cool. So your code should be dry, right? Don't repeat yourself. Rule of thumb, introduce a helper function when code is performing the same task more than once. So if I have an application where I'm performing the same task more than once throughout the application, time to break that out into a helper function, right? And then another plug here, never ever have code that is not being used. I cannot emphasize that more enough. If I see code that's been commented out or a big block of code that's not doing anything, it looks really bad, okay? So always make sure that your code is tight, and so we don't have repeated code, we don't have code that's not being used. Cool. So what we're looking for, code that's not doing anything. Could you explain why every piece of code is essential, right? That every piece of code needs to be there. Are there any repetitions, and could it be refactored into a helper function, right? So if I'm seeing a lot of functionality that's being repeated, I'm going to wonder why didn't they refactor that in, right? Cool. Conscientious with our data, right? So not performing unnecessary fetch calls would be an example in JavaScript, React, so anything front end, right? We want to be really conscientious with that because anything that's doing request response is pretty expensive as an operation, right? It takes a lot of time. Only pass data to the functions that actually need it. So really honoring that single source of truth principle, right? We want to make sure that our functions are only handling data, state, etc., that it needs, right? So that's going to protect our data and make sure that we're not performing these expensive operations of passing data around where it doesn't need to be passed. Same thing goes for state and props, right? Cool. What we're looking for, so is your code following the single source of truth principle, right? Any functions that have access to data that don't need it. So again, you're passing a lot of data around, which is making data open for corruption. It's also expensive, takes a lot of time. Any components with unnecessary state or props, right? So that's kind of a big one for me, is if I see components that don't need access to a given state or don't need access to props or to a given piece of props, it's a pretty strong indication that maybe you don't fully understand why we use React and some of its advantages, right? Or any of the front-end frameworks. Cool. So a note on cleverness. So kind of what I said earlier, we want to find that balance between being clever and being readable. So what is clever? Because sometimes I see people lean away from having short and tight functions because they're like, well, I don't want to be clever. So what is cleverness? I love this. It's from one of our lead instructors. I'm basically checking to see if you code like a psychopath, right? So if you are so clever that it is highly unreadable and it wouldn't have a place in a code base at all, that's too clever, right? We want it to be short, we want it to be tight, but it needs to be readable. I love Code Wars for checking in on this, right? Because Code Wars actually has that spectrum of cleverness to best practices. And so you can get a really good idea of what you should be doing and how you should be syntaxing certain solutions, right? Cool. So some resources for this. Books that I love, and again, I tend to lean more towards the front end, so this is where these recommendations are coming from. You don't know JavaScript, and actually this is a free repo on GitHub, so you can 100% just go read that. Elegant JavaScript, also the PDF is free. For anything Ruby or object-oriented, I love Sandy Sandy Metz's object-oriented programming, right? Really great book for that. Code Wars, doing a code war pretty frequently is going to give you some context for when something's too clever versus a best practice of solution. Open source, really good for this. Any volunteer organizations that have you working with other teams, your fellow students, alumni, former instructors getting feedback from us, right? And then some of those tech-specific Slack channels. And what I really love, tech-specific meetups. So going to a tech-specific meetup, you're going to get an idea of how that technology is being treated in the industry that you're job searching in, right? So it's really important to go to meetups that are specific to your area, which a lot of them are online right now, right? And so the reason you want to do that is because people that are actually programming in those technologies in your area that are going to have jobs are going to be talking about how they use that technology. Having that context is so useful in an interview for explaining why you do something. Right? Cool. So finally, I always like to end my presentations with a call to action. So typically it's pretty short, something that you could do in like 15 to 20 minutes, right? So this is my challenge to you. Sometime today, ask someone to grill one of your repos that are pinned to your overview. Send that code to them. Ask them to grill you on it, right? You can pick a fellow grad, a former instructor, your career coach even, because your career coach is going to be able to read through this and say if it's messy or not, which is actually really great feedback. And then finally, my favorite, a networking contact. So if you are going to meetups, if you are making friends in the industry, something that I do a lot and that I encourage my students to do is say, hey, I am really excited about getting into React Native. I know you're a React Native developer. Would it be all right if you looked over my code and gave me some feedback? A lot of people in the community are open to that because we're so excited about getting people into tech. So keep that in mind too. And with that, that is all I have for the presentation. Thank you so much for letting me talk for so long. And I am really excited to answer your guys' questions. So let's do this. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then Molly, I might have you moderate the chat channel for questions. Does that sound good?
Yep, you got it. There was a question right up front just to kick us off with whether private repos register on your contribution graph.
They absolutely do. Yeah, so your private repos do register on your contribution graph. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's see, another question. Will you look through commit history to see if we do a big refactor at the end compared to keeping it clean as we go?
That's a great question.
Is that going to create a less than optimal impression?
Yeah, I love that question. I think it really depends, right? It depends on how much time we have. Typically, we're just going to look through the final product, right? Where we might ask about that is in the interview or the code review. Tell me about your process, right? Is this the finished product or did you have something before it? Walk me through what it was like for you to refactor into this, right? That's probably what we would do is just ask follow-up questions. Great question. Yeah.
And a couple upvotes. Sam mentioned, someone asked earlier about the new GitHub README thing. Sam, might need you to elaborate on that or Frank.
Yeah. Let me think about it. I'm just getting used to the new README syntax. So I'm trying to think if there's anything additional to what it is. Let me think about that. I don't think I could offer anything specific to the new README format. I'm also still getting used to it. So I'll leave you with that. I don't think it's changed too much. Yeah, that's what I've got. So yeah.
Great. Amanda says, will this recording be available? Yes, we post all of our career services webinars in a YouTube playlist. So I'll make sure everyone has the link there. And as we add more content, they will show up there. Another question, I set up my GitHub name before I understood it was public. It's a silly name, and I'm guessing my username should be changed to something more professional, like your actual name. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's not uncommon, right? So you can change it. I think additionally, you can change the path as well. I know I've had a student that their link for GitHub is like GitHub/their name. So it is customizable. So it should be accessed in the settings tab. You can change that. Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, I heard someone chime in. Go right ahead.
Yeah. I'm not sure. So it's about the README. I don't know if like the README thing is like I think they're talking about on the actual profile page. Did you see that, Jesse? Like people can actually put a small README on their profile page that shows up above the pinned repos.
Okay. Yeah, like a new bio. I haven't seen that. I'm actually, like I said, I'm just getting used to the new things that GitHub is giving us, which is pretty exciting. I know that you can also link a blog into GitHub now, which I'm just starting to experiment with. So definitely check out some of those new features. Yeah.
All right, cool.
Thanks, Meg. Yeah, it sounds like everyone's kind of adapting to the new feature. And there's a question here about bio format. I think what Jesse highlighted earlier is just the idea that your LinkedIn bio should be more of your professional story and your journey, and that's something your career coaches can really help you with if you're not quite sure on how to nail that down. Whereas your GitHub bio is really like your technical story and skill set. Did I capture that right, Jesse?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, I think we've got time for maybe 2 more quick ones. Doug says, majority of my current coding is learning new languages and frameworks through the course. Can I use those for my commits?
Yeah, so learning new, yeah, you can absolutely use that for your commits. I would say when it comes time to pin a repo though, just make sure that it's something your own. So not something that's directly copied from a tutorial or directly from a lab. It's fine that those are your commits, but make sure you're pinning an original repo from those technologies too. Yeah.
Nice. And then I guess just to close this out, since we're right at 45 minutes, a lot of interest in open source projects. So do you have any favorite places that you can find open source projects?
Yeah, DigitalOcean always hosts a hackathon, and so they have really great resources on where you can find some of those open source projects. Additionally, a lot of our favorite technologies are actually open source. So like, for example, Babel is an open source project, which is kind of fun. You can find lots of lists on Google. I really like DigitalOcean's. In addition to that, I'm kind of using that term open source loosely to also talk about some of these volunteer organizations. So one of my favorite organizations is Code for America. Most major cities have their own outshoot of that. So like Code for Denver, great opportunities there. Yeah.
All right, we're gonna wrap there. I just posted the YouTube playlist where all of our past webinars live. As soon as this recording becomes available, I will add it to that. We'll also circulate that link in the Jobs Weekly email that comes, so keep an eye out. And hope to see you back here next week, same time. We're going to be talking about deconstructing technical assessments. And so really excited. We have several weeks of these talks lined up, and just want to say a big thank you, Jesse, to you for your time and your expertise here.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Yeah.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Have a great one.